Hello everyone. If you've watched this channel, you'll note that I like to tackle the modern bands participating in the technical death metal genre. And the reason I do that is because this is a genre that has compelled me since I started listening to metal, and the reason it has a stranglehold on me is because one of the major tenets of death metal that I find so intriguing is the esoteric nature of it. And if you think about it, metal on the whole is not meant to be digested by the masses. It's meant to be dangerous, it's meant to be adventurous, and it's meant to make us confront things that we normally do not want to confront. And if you up the ante in terms of how you present that music and have it be a whirlwind of chaotic techniques to showcase a lot of those elements, you wind up having material that is both esoteric in theme and presentation. So that's why I gravitate towards this specific genre, and those elements are what's sorely missing from how the genre is presented today. So I wanted to make a video showcasing a lot of bands that bring forth the duality of what I've just described, and at the same time have a unique presentation to their material as a whole. One of the major drawbacks to this genre now is that it feels very homogeneous. All the bands sound the same, they present their material in the same ways, they use the same note clusters, they use the same checklist of how to present this kind of material to an audience, because instead of it having that esoteric nature behind it, the goal is to appeal to people. And people are unique enough where if you present an organic presentation of who you are, it's going to be naturally esoteric. If you go ahead and write music that checks the boxes so that you're able to maintain an audience or garner new people to your product, it starts stripping away those esoteric layers. And then you have a product as opposed to an artistic statement. So I wanted to showcase a few bands. I'm going to talk about them pretty briefly as opposed to how I normally discuss bands, because there's a lot to be said for the foundation of the technical death metal genre. And I wanted to do this because you'll see the moniker tech death now, or tech deaf if you want to give it a little bit of slander, and I really feel that as much as it's splitting hairs, and I've discussed this with Goatcraft, I think that those, despite the fact that the moniker is similar, should really be separated. Because if you look at the bands I'm about to present, you'll note that they resonate with the technical death metal label, and if you bring up the label tech death, you have an entire different palette that's bouncing around in your mind. You know exactly what that's going to sound like. Whereas if I were to say, oh, it's a technical death metal band, you can't pinpoint that sound because so many bands did it in a unique way. So I'm going to discuss a few of those, and a lot of these are going to be on the fringes of what death metal is, but it still showcases that the creative peak of a lot of what this genre produced is many decades in the past. And the material that's being presented as the most progressive, most technical, most challenging, none of that is true if you compare it to the foundation that was laid out before it. So one of the first records I want to talk about is the perfectly titled Spiritually Uncontrolled Art by Liars in Wait. I'm not going to talk about the lineage of the members. I just want to get really quickly down to what this record is. And I wanted to start the video with this band because this is about as challenging as you can get while maintaining the tenets of what death metal is, of what metal is, and still having it be technical and having that be a name which showcases how this is different from normal death metal. This is a frenzied whirlwind of death metal language that is still succinct. You hear all of the familiar tropes of what the language of death metal is. You have your typical power chords, you have your tritones, you have a brief flirtations with like a minor second type of harmony, just that one note off, really unsettling type of material. But the energy is so chaotic and frenzied that you end up kind of getting lost in the maelstrom of what this material is. And it's a great kind of lost because that aggression is still there. You never get bored listening to this. And it maintains the esoteric nature of what death metal is, in that you can listen to it multiple times and you'll start piecing together the themes. You'll start getting it, but it's very alienating to begin with. And it's that way on purpose. It's not trying to give you the rewarding hooks for participating in this genre. It's not trying to welcome you at all. And it's only about 17 minutes. The material that this band has produced is right here. It's all they've done, and it is all that they needed to do. They could have continued and given us more of this kind of material, but they said what they needed to say here. They gave you a presentation that is deliberately difficult, but still has so much aggression to it. And a lot of the reason why it's so difficult is because there's very little to the drums other than just regular timekeeping. And the tempos will fluctuate to denote that there are different passages happening, but for the most part, you're hearing like kind of a metronome feel to the riffs. And it's very easy to get lost in that, but the aggression carries you through. You'll wind up being at the end of this record feeling bewildered in the best of ways, as opposed to when you feel bewildered by a modern death metal product, modern tech metal product. The reason you'll feel bewildered listening to that is because the arrangements don't make sense, and they'll bring in kitschy phrases or kitschy forced dynamics to try to kind of give it the illusion of depth, where whether it's here, this is very honed in. This is giving you its musical language immediately, and it doesn't defer from that, but it still presents you enough twists and turns to keep you engaged, and you don't end up shutting your brain off because there's just so much hitting you at once. This is a very savage, barely tenuously held package, and it does it in the best of ways. So I highly recommend this record. If a lot of the arguments I'm getting are that a lot of the bands that you tackle are really innovative because they present you the brutality and the melody and all those things that are foreign to this genre. If you listen to a record like this, you'll hear all of those things, and it was done in like 1992. So this is you can't recreate this album. There's a nature to it where it feels so barely held together because that's the presentation they wanted to give you. And if you wanted to make this record now with the kind of people that would make a modern metal record, they would immediately snap it to a metronome, immediately try to think about the audience first, find ways to welcome the crowd, and then they would fashion their music around those ideas. And any kind of esoteric qualities that they would try to get inside this music would be related to the techniques that they present. If they can make it feel robotic, if they can make it feel absurdly fast or brutal, whatever that means for modern production values, all of those would miss the point of what this band did all those years ago. And if we could get this kind of aggression back in what modern bands are doing, I wouldn't have nearly as much criticism as I have, but what's being presented now as an esoteric form of metal is just very welcoming and toothless. There's no danger to it. There's nothing edgy about it. It's cramming down very vague, extreme ideas or horror ideas in a very streamlined and accessible package. That is not at all what this is. So give this a shot. 17 minutes, and I promise you, you're going to hear some stuff that is going to remain with you and at the same time reward you upon multiple listens. The next record I wanted to talk about was Syzygial Miscreancy by Hellwich. And if you were to be familiar with this band, you would note that a lot of what you'll hear on this record feels more at home with like a progressive thrash metal label, and that's true. But the arrangements are far more adventurous. They're not rooted in the idea of getting you to the chorus, and the command of the material has a lot more of the techniques that you'll see developed in death metal, such as blast beats and flirtations with chromatic riffing styles, as opposed to having very consonant material that is presented in a lot of thrash metal bands. The arrangements here are difficult not quite like Liars in Wait, but in a similar regard, and they'll use the same techniques of jarring you with sudden pauses, kind of similar to what you would find on The Red in the Sky Is Ours, where that's the only break you get from a melodic barrage. You get that brief palate cleanser that you'll get from a band stopping on a dime and presenting you with a similar vibe, but with a slight tonal change. You'll get a lot of that in this record. And what I think works a lot here is that marriage of the riffing styles of thrash metal with the command of the arrangements that you'd find in death metal. So I think this is definitely worth a listen. You can feel that the band is still trying to get their footing and who they want to be, kind of similar to what happened on Piece of Time for Atheist. If you listen to that record, you'll note that the first track on it is the most, I don't want to say progressive, but the most challenging, in that there are a lot of themes that they throw at you, and it feels kind of pieced together poorly, because you could tell they wanted to be a progressive band, but they didn't quite have a craft at how to manage all of the themes together while still having a lot of the natural flow that you would get in a band that really knows what they're doing. So that first song on this feels a lot like the song Piece of Time, where there are just abrupt stops and then new themes are explored, but it does it in a way where it feels like they're getting their footing, and they do kind of land on their feet a lot more solidly as the record continues. So if you're a fan of the vibe of thrash metal, but taken to a little bit more of an extreme, definitely give this a shot. It's an older record, 1990, and it's interesting to see how the two genres that are presented here kind of branched off, and what worked for both elements presented on this record. So definitely give it a listen. So you can't talk about technical death metal without a focus on Atheist, and I had just talked about the title track from the Piece of Time record. This is the fully realized vision that you would hear on the Piece of Time track. On that song, they wanted to present you a lot of melodic ideas that were loosely tied together and felt kind of piecemeal, but you could tell that they were trying to be a technical, progressive band. They wanted to have the language of death metal intact, but still have a more adventurous arrangement than the other bands at the time. And this is the fully fleshed out version of what you would hear on that track. The songs are very much more tightly composed. You don't hear a lot of stops and starts and completely new themes and new tempos being presented to you. And this is probably the best showcase of their take on the death metal language while having a progressive approach to it. Whereas when the band continued with the Elements record, they went a little bit up their own ass, and they presented you with a lot of very death metal adjacent ideas and themes that were not even remotely within the same genre of what death metal is. And that's not meant to be a direct slight. You can do that, but that record felt a little more hackneyed, whereas this is a very focused progressive death metal record. And if you were to look at what modern tech death is, you would see that a lot of those bands are very homogeneous in sound. And although there were plenty of bands that back in the day, if you talked about a technical death metal band or a progressive death metal band, you would have an idea of which bands those were, but you still would be able to pick them out just by hearing them alone. And this record has a very unique presentation, a very focused one. It's a direct and very confident statement, as opposed to how they pussyfooted around a very well thought out arrangement with what you heard on Piece of Time. This is the fully realized vision of that. So definitely give this a listen. It's a challenging record, but it's Atheist at their most focused. One of the more popular death metal bands around is Suffocation. And the reason that they are so popular is because despite the fact that they have pretty challenging material, it's presented in a very savage way, which can be appreciated by both diehard metal fans and those who kind of just flirt with the aesthetics of what metal is. And even though a lot of people that listen to this band are probably going to listen to Pierced from Within and Beyond, the most challenging material that they have by far is on this record, Breeding the Spawn. And it gets overlooked because the production is very alienating. To most people that want to hear a percussive, heavy band like Suffocation, they're going to want to hear a more rounded out production such as you would hear on Pierced from Within. This is very icicles in the ear kind of presentation, and the alienating aspect of that production actually lends itself to the material if you allow it to. But if you were like me as a kid and you heard Pierced from Within first when it was released and then moved backwards, you probably weren't going to appreciate this record for what it was. And it is a very challenging record, very challenging. The songs end up kind of gelling into one complete album vibe, but the command of the material is presented in such a way where it's so confident and still savage. It's still this is the most death metal of the bands I'm going to cover here, in that first and foremost, you're going to hear that savagery. And if you want to get cerebral about it, you can concentrate on the arrangements and concentrate on how the riffs are pieced together. But as an experience, it can be valued in a multitude of ways. And the frenzied nature of the approach here is similar to what you would have heard on that Liars in Wait record, but the tempo shifts and the difference within how the material is presented to you in terms of the themes that you're getting barraged with make it really stand on its own. And I think that this is Suffocation at its least restrained. Pierced from Within is a great record. I don't really care for anything that happened after it. Despise the Sun is pretty good, but it's definitely stripped down. This is a very focused yet completely chaotic Suffocation. And if the material is too difficult for you to get into because the production is so jarring, there are different takes on the record presented on YouTube. There's a fan remaster that is fucking super balls to the wall, leveled out, and that's, you know, it's difficult, but at the same time you can hear what's going on, and it still feels like the original record. But the band has been presenting a track from this record re-recorded on each album that has came out afterwards. So if you wanted to, you could listen to those tracks individually with modern production values and hear what actually was going on. But if you wanted to be presented with a very, very challenging percussive death metal record, it doesn't get much more challenging than this, while still maintaining that sense of melody that ties the whole experience together. I mean, there were bands that came after this that were definitely influenced by it, like your Disgorge and stuff like that, American Disgorge, and that material is challenging, but there's not really a command of melody there at all. This is still trying to give you a song-based experience and an album-based experience, as opposed to a band like Disgorge, where you know exactly what the band is giving you in the first couple of minutes, and there's very little to denote the need for multiple records in that style. So give this one a listen. Like I said, if you cannot handle the production, there's more ways to experience the record than the original pressing, and it's one of the records that if you give it enough listens, if you give it enough time, you'll start to appreciate the arrangements and understand why this genre has a need to be both esoteric yet still provide you with those layers peeling back upon multitudes of listens, and then you'll get the full experience. This is a grower of a record, and that's what all the best metal should be. one of the more difficult entries in the old school metal pantheon would be Confessor's Condemned. And this is not regarded as a death metal record, so you would be wondering why I would include it here. The reason it's not looked at as a death metal record is mainly because of the vocal stylings. It got to the point where metal, unfortunately, was subgrouped based on vocals beyond anything else. And there are arrangements and note preferences that you would hear in death metal that make that genre what it is, and it's not essentially just tied to the idea that you have to have like gruff Cookie Monster style vocals. A lot of people will regard this band as a technical doom band, and I could see that more on their reunion record. A lot of what's happening here, even though it does have slower tempos, the musical language that you hear here has a lot more in line with what death metal is. There's a lot more of adventure to the arrangements. There's a lot more of, you'll hear the melodic lines be harmonized just in thirds. That's a very death metal thing to do. And like the best death metal, it is forcibly esoteric. The material here is very, very challenging, but there's enough space here where you can get lost in it, and it's not frenzied like the other material I've talked about here on this video. It's relaxed, but it's still very challenging. And let's talk about the vocals. You can't talk about Confessor without talking about the vocals. So what you hear here is kind of like the barely in key stuff that you would hear Ray Alder do on early Fates Warning records. And sometimes he's landing in the best possible way, and it really does make the experience united. Sometimes he doesn't, but it doesn't take you out of the experience, because the approach this band has is one of that alienating, forcibly alienating aspect. They want the audience to be presented with who they are, and they don't give a fuck about who you want them to be. And there's not a whole lot out there that resembles what this band is. So a lot of people are going to talk about this as being more within the doom metal genre, but if you listen to the title track especially, you'll hear that musical language of death metal being presented to you, but with that shrieking high vocal style that you'll hear in kind of like a progressive metal band. But it's not refined. It's very much more kind of stream of consciousness type of vocals, and it works because the music is so focused, and the percussion of the band is laying out a rhythm that is it's syncopated in a Meshuggah kind of way, but the material is much more spacious, and there's much more of a melodic sensibility to it, whereas you have this effervescent vocal style over the top that is not grounded like the music is. So you have this duality presented to you in a very unnerving way, which is what the best of death metal can do. So give this a listen. Like I said, you're going to be presented with a record that doesn't align itself with what the traditional elements of death metal will sound like to you, but the forced esoteric nature of it makes it aligned far more with death metal than what the most accessible metal genre, doom, actually is. So give it a shot. So although I've covered essentially pretty old records, I did want to showcase a couple of different albums that came out within this century to showcase that it's not really just the idea that I don't think that bands are capable of it in the modern era. It can happen, but it requires a mind that is focused on the composition and the presentation of an identity that is established in who the artist is. And you really do get that from this band Martyr. Although you can really boil down the experience of what this band is to two basic ideas, it's what you would hear if you were to take the material presented on Death's individual thought patterns and marry it with what you heard in the note choice and arrangements of Voivod's Nothing Face. But if you took those ideas and push the technicality of the riffs and the arrangements up to 11. That's what this band is, and this is the fully realized vision of that approach. And that being said, going all the way back to the band's first record, Hopeless Hopes, which came out in 1997, this is a logical progression from that. This doesn't feel like Atheist being a fairly streamlined death metal band and then becoming what they were on Unquestionable Presence. This is a band who had an identity in mind and developed as they continued and came to this logical conclusion. That being said, it's a very challenging record. And it's challenging even though the material is extremely melodic. It's melodic, and the songs are identifiable by the melody. The themes are showcased as having importance, which is very, very good in song composition, and it's an idea that you don't see anymore. As hard as this material is to digest, you'll come away from it remembering which theme is incorporated in each song on it, and all of the songs present the need to be there to contribute to a greater whole. And that's also something you don't see anymore. But it's so melodically engaging and difficult that it steps outside the boundaries of what the death metal moniker is, and then they reel you back in with some of the death metal aesthetics that will make you feel like you're listening to a death metal record. But on the whole, it really is speaking from the musical language that is more akin to what you would hear on Voivod and later Death, where there really isn't that much death metal to it. And especially if you consider Daniel Mongrain's vocals, he has more of a hardcore holler. You will get the gruff death metal vocals here and there on the record, but for the most part, this is more focused on the technical element of the technical death metal genre than the death metal element. And it's a great engaging listen. There's none of the savagery present in what death metal might feel to you. It's a very clean presentation, and they had that same cleanliness all the way back to Hopeless Hopes. And it can be aggressive at times, but it is done so in a more cerebral way and less a from the heart kind of way. So I think that if the focus of modern bands was more on this kind of style, where the technique is important, but the composition is very cerebrally put together, you would have more of an artistic foundation than the idea that I'm just going to hit you with some flashy techniques, songcraft be damned. So give this a listen. I mean, I really think that this record in particular, if you want to talk about technical material, really puts pretty much everything that's coming out now to shame. It's not a record I would revisit often, mainly because it's all head and no heart. But if you want to talk about tech death, it really does deserve a mention here. So there was a time where if you wanted to talk about technical death metal, you had to talk about a few bands, and Pestilence and Atheist were always going to be discussed. And when this record came out, when Spheres came out, it was hated. And I understand why, because if you were to listen to old Pestilence, the material was engaging and somewhat complex, but it was death metal. You knew what you were getting, and it was good death metal. If you want to listen to Consuming Impulse or Testimony of the Ancients, those are good records. This branched out a lot, got a lot of flack for it, and there was a lot of synths on the record, which took a lot of death metal fans out of the experience. But if you appreciate it for what it is now, when it's not quite as important to just completely deride a band for experimenting as it was back in the day when we were trying to protect what the genre was, you'll find a record here that is complex, engaging, but very well put together. And the reliance on the synths for atmosphere it's effective. it doesn't come across as gimmicky. It feels like it's presenting another layer of the material to kind of give you a full presentation that they didn't really have on previous records. There wasn't a whole lot separating Pestilence from the Pack back then, but this record there was. And, you know, I understand why people didn't like it, but if you look at how far removed from death metal we are now when we talk about death metal, this deserves far more of a footing in what death metal is than any of the modern bands that are polluting the airwaves now. And I had a lot of hopes for when the band reunited, but everything they've put out after that is, wow, it's really average and really bad. But I think that this is definitely worth a listen. It's I don't want to say the word interesting, because interesting implies that it's superficially competent, and it's something that you'll kind of have the idea of wanting to get to know on a superficial level. But it's focused, and it's got that sci-fi element to it that if you listen to like The Key from Nocturnus, that record wanted to paint a palette of a sci-fi approach on death metal. I think that this is a far more successful approach at it than The Key was. The Key is fine for what it is, but as much as it tries to give you a full-fledged experience, there's so much happening in The Key that really takes you out of what the album is trying to be. Mainly the guitar solos, or it's just a slightly better but equally frenzied Kerry King on The Key that takes you completely out of the experience, and the arrangements are put together in a way where they really do kind of just try to jam a lot of themes together ass to ass and call it a day. You don't have that on this record. This is a far more focused affair than what The Key was, and it still gives you that sci-fi death metal aesthetic, but in a much more successful way. So definitely worth a listen. Here's a record not a whole lot of people know about, Dreamweaver from Golem. This came out in, I think, 2006, so it's a more modern release. And of course, as we bridged to the current century, we started stripping away a lot of the aesthetic of the metal that we grew up loving. A lot of the ideas of what death metal presents to you started getting cast to the wayside, but this band managed to find its own voice and present it to us more on this record than on the two that they had released previously. And it's not, nobody really talks about this band, but I promise you that if you listen to this, you're going to feel like you're listening to a band that is very concerned with its identity first and foremost, which I think is great. If you're going to be a technical death metal band, and this isn't really that technical, but if you're going to be a metal band in general, this far into the genre's life, it's going to be very hard for you to make a name for yourself without betraying a lot of the principles of what metal is, and they don't do that here. This is still very much a metal record, but the approach is super unique to who they are, while at the same time not sacrificing the quality of the material. The songs are very well put together. The musical language that they use is very unique to them. You know it's them when you hear it. It wasn't quite like that on the two records that they put out beforehand. This is more rooted in the extreme techniques that you saw with the birth of this century, hyper fast drumming, a concentration on brutality, and the melody usage here is still very apparent while maintaining some of that savagery that you would find in a band like Suffocation, but this is a much more, I don't want to say nuanced, but a much more unique take on that percussive death metal styling with melodies interwoven. And I think they're still active, but they haven't put out anything since then, and I think this is definitely worth listening to. It's a modern, quasi-modern release that still managed to survive the birth of a new millennium without having it become a homogenized mess of tropes. And there's very few bands that can do that and can say that. This is esoteric, like the best of a lot of the bands that I've covered, a lot of the best death metal, but It's a little more engaging. The arrangements aren't quite as alienating. There is song to each experience on the record, and it feels packaged as a complete experience. When you're finished with the record, you feel like you have a fully realized idea of who the band is, and it can't really be replicated, or at least it hasn't been, mainly because the band is fairly unknown, and the paths that they took on it are not ones that would be traveled very often. But it still maintains the death metal backbone, which is very important, and it has all the savagery, it has all the melody, but it's still immediately identifiable as being this band. So give this a listen. There's not a whole lot that happened at the turn of the century that has an approach like this. If I were to compare this to a band, if you don't know what this band sounds like, I would say it's like if Stargazer knew how to write songs. And Blood Incantation, that's a band that completely ripped off Stargazer. That doesn't feel like this at all. Blood Incantation doesn't feel like Golem. And it doesn't feel like that mainly because Blood Incantation can't write songs either. You know, if you're going to rip off a band like Stargazer who really can't write songs, you're going to wind up having that same pitfall yourself. This has the vibe that you would get from a band like Stargazer and Blood Incantation, but with a much more focused approach. So if you like that kind of style, you like that modern take on an old school vibe, give this a shot. The last band that I wanted to focus on is Noism from Japan. This is a band that I regard more as being satire than a legitimate artistic statement. And the reasoning for that is that although it has the aesthetics of death metal, it sounds like death metal, and it has the adventurous structuring of technical death metal, it does so in such an extreme way where it comes across more as sardonic than artistically deliberate. And the reasoning for that is because it's a programmed drums, guitar, and vocals affair, and the drums are programmed in a way where it is not even remotely trying to appear human. The arrangements are set where it feels stream of consciousness, but you'll have bits of melody that pop up through the chaos to kind of ground you in kind of a little bit of a human experience. But at the same time, this has much more in common with noise than structured death metal as you and I both know it. That being said, what I do appreciate about this is because it feels like stream of consciousness, it manages to get the cerebral nature of technical death metal without losing the id and the heart of the savagery of the death metal experience. When death metal gets overwrought, when the focus is so much on getting the technical aspects of it across, you end up stripping away the layers of the savage nature of death metal. This band, despite not being a true death metal band, has a lot more of the heart of what the death metal experience is than a modern tech death band. This is far more extreme of an experience than all of the very inviting palettes of sound that you get from the modern tech death band. I don't feel like this is a record that warrants repeated listens, but I wanted to include it here because it is showcasing that you can present an approach of technical death metal and not have it be streamlined, not have it be rooted in the commonplace techniques that you know it to have today. And there are similar projects that have emerged since then that kind of have that stream of consciousness vibe to it. As much maligned as Colin Marston is in the death metal genre, his Ensign Athrak project has this kind of vibe going for it, where it's complete and utter chaos with little songcraft to it, but there is something to be said for the idea that it is outright savagery that has the hints of a cerebral nature of technique behind it, but without losing itself in the idea that you are forcibly trying to showcase to an audience that you're a technically sound musician. So it's worth checking out. It's worth a cursory glance, but on the whole, it's more satire, more ridiculous than being a legitimate band. So that's kind of what I wanted to discuss in this quick round of band discussion. The important thing to take away from this is that the reason that I am so hard on these bands is because the idea of what technical death metal can be is opening the parameters of the musical language of death metal, which it can have. Death metal does not have to have a very strict set of ideas to make it what it is, as opposed to like black metal. There's a lot of room for experimentation and progression in death metal, and all of these bands have done it while still keeping the backbone of the death metal experience, and they've done it in a unique way for each one. When you hear all of these bands, you know who you're listening to. If you put on any band on the Artisan era, you're not going to be able to tell them apart. And that a lot of that can have to do with production. Modern production that bands use. It all sounds the same. But if you're focusing, you can pinpoint all of the techniques that all of those bands are abusing, all of the same arrangement of tones that all of them are using, all of the same genre tropes that all of them are using. None of the bands discussed here adhere to any of that, and they all are within that metal subgenre where they belong to a specific sect of an understanding of what this is while still maintaining identity. You can do that. It's still doable. And all of these bands are far more progressive than what you hear nowadays. All of the new bands don't even hold a candle to the approach and the ideas that a lot of these older bands had. And for a genre that's lauding itself as challenging the accepted notion of what a genre is, it's really a shame that it's become so streamlined and so homogenous and so uninspired. For all of the faults that these records have that I've discussed, all of them are inspired. Not a single one of them feels like they didn't want to present who they were to the audience, and they wanted to do it organically. They didn't want to do it by forcing you to adhere to the idea that they are presenting to you a display of techniques where the technique is far more important than the message. That may be said of Noism, but for the most part, all of the bands here have the message intact. Some of them were not as successful as delivering it, but the message is more important than the techniques on display. And all of them have done so while maintaining that esoteric nature of the exclusionary aspects of metal. We don't want everyone to enjoy this. We don't want everyone to understand this. Not everyone can or should understand it. But those that get it and those who want to explore more of what this genre can be, it's all there. And none of these bands compose their material with a checklist in mind for what the audience wants to hear. And people that were able to get into these releases weren't doing so because they sat down and they wanted to hear themselves in someone else's product. They didn't have an idea of, this is what I like, this is what I understand about who I am, this is what I understand about human nature. I want to find those things in other artists. That you would find that idea in pop music. People that like pop want to hear the same romantic drivel. They want to hear their experiences being broadcast back to them so they have their own personal echo chamber. None of that is here. If you are going to listen to the bands I've discussed here, you are getting their unfiltered experience. You're not getting you in it. And that's why these bands are not as appreciated as a lot of the more popular modern bands. Listeners of the modern bands want to hear their ambitions being broadcast back in their face because they're so fueled by their own egos and that need for gratification, that immediate gratification you get from the flashy techniques. These bands prove that you could have all the technique in the world and still showcase who you are and not have it be rooted in such a selfish listener experience. So give the bands a shot. I'm not saying I love all of the products I've talked about today, but I wanted to prove that there is a lot of room within technical death metal to explore, and it doesn't have to be what it is today. So thank you for listening.